The divorce papers were still warm from the printer when the first black SUV turned into the gates. Talia Winters stood in the marble foyer of a house that had never once felt like hers, watching rain streak the tall windows, and counted the headlights as they came up the long drive one after another. 6, 8, 10. By the time the count reached 12, she understood this was not a courtesy. It was a message, delivered the way every message in this house had always been delivered, with more men and more steel than the moment actually required. Behind her, Jae-ho Kong stood in the doorway of his study, still in yesterday's shirt, his tie gone, his jaw set in the particular stillness she had learned to read as a storm being held very deliberately in place. He did not come toward her. He watched the cars the way he watched everything, cataloging, calculating, already 3 moves ahead of whatever was about to happen on his own front steps. The rain had not let up since the night before, and it struck the tall windows in steady sheets that blurred the headlights into long smears of white, giving the whole scene the look of something already half-remembered, a memory forming before it had even finished happening. Talia pulled her coat tighter around herself, though the house was warm, an old habit from the first months of her marriage, when she had never quite trusted that any room here was actually safe. "You didn't tell them to come?" Talia said. It wasn't a question. She already knew the answer from the tight line of his shoulders. "I told them nothing," he said, "which means someone above me decided this needed to be decided for both of us." 2 years earlier, Talia Winters had been an interpreter, hired for a single evening to translate for a shipping delegation at a downtown hotel, a job she had taken because the pay was good and the work was supposed to be simple. It had not stayed simple. Halfway through the dinner, a man at the head of the table had been shot through the window of a private dining room, and in the chaos that followed, in the 4 minutes before anyone with a badge arrived, Jae-ho Kong had pulled her behind an overturned table and covered her body with his own, his hand pressed flat against the back of her skull, his voice low and steady in her ear telling her to breathe and stay down and trust him for exactly as long as it took the shooting to stop. It had stopped in under a minute. Her life had not gone back to normal in the 2 years since. She had not chosen this world. She understood that clearly, standing in the foyer now with divorce papers curling slightly from the heat of the printer tray. She had been an interpreter in the wrong room on the wrong night, and Jae-ho Kong, seeing a witness who could either be a liability or an asset, had made the calculation that kept his organization safest. Marriage. A legal bond that made her testimony inadmissible against him, that folded her quietly into his world, where she could be watched, protected, and controlled all at once. She had said yes because the alternative, made clear to her without ever being spoken aloud, was a kind of danger she had not been foolish enough to test. The wedding itself had been small, clinical, held in a private room with a handful of witnesses who signed documents, more than they celebrated anything. She remembered standing across from him in a borrowed dress that did not fit quite right, watching his face for some sign of what he actually felt about binding his name to a stranger's, and finding nothing there at all. It had frightened her more than the shooting had. A man who could marry someone with that much composure was a man capable of anything, and she had spent the drive home from the courthouse deciding, privately, that she would learn every inch of that composure before she let herself feel safe inside it. In the early months, she had tested that composure the only way she knew how, small acts of quiet defiance, refusing the driver he assigned her twice a week just to see what he would do about it, staying out later than he expected without explanation. He never punished her for it. He only watched, patient, recalculating, the way she imagined he watched every problem in his life, and slowly she came to understand that his patience was not indifference. It was the particular attention of a man deciding whether something was worth protecting before he let himself admit he already knew the answer. That was the story most people in his organization believed. It was not the whole story, and Talia had spent 2 years learning the difference between the parts that were true and the parts that were merely useful. 12 black SUVs. Her family owned exactly none of them. Whoever had sent this convoy through the gates in the gray hour before breakfast wanted every soldier loyal to Jae-ho Kong to see, without ambiguity, that the wife he had just divorced belonged to someone with more cars and more men than he currently had standing in his own driveway. The front door opened before either of them reached it. A man stepped through first, silver-haired, dressed in a suit that cost more than most of the furniture in the room, and Talia recognized him instantly from the one photograph she had ever seen of him, kept in a locked drawer in Jaeho's study that she was not supposed to know existed. "Director Han," Jaeho said, and something in his voice had gone flatter, more careful, the voice of a man greeting someone he could not afford to insult and could not afford to trust either. "I heard you sign the papers this morning," Director Han said, his eyes moving from Jaeho to Talia and back again, unhurried, the way a man looked at a transaction he had already decided the outcome of. "That was a mistake. She belongs to this family whether the paperwork says so or not. I'm here to correct the arrangement." Talia felt the room's temperature drop several degrees and understood, with the clarity of someone who had learned to read danger in rooms like this, that she had just become the object of a negotiation between two men who had not once, in the last 10 minutes, asked her a single question about what she wanted. She glanced at Jaeho and found his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on Han with a stillness that told her he was already 3 moves into a conversation he had not yet said out loud. "She's not luggage," Talia said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Whatever you think you're here to correct, you can address it to me directly. I'm standing right here." Director Han's eyebrows rose slightly, the first genuine reaction he had shown since walking through the door. Jaeho's eyes cut toward her, something flickering behind them that was not quite alarm and not quite pride, a complicated mixture of both. "She is spirit," Director Han said to Jaeho, as though she had not spoken at all. "That's part of why my son wants her." "Your son?" Talia repeated. "Woojin," Director Han said. "He has admired you for some time. From a distance, respectfully. Now that Jaeho has released you, there is no longer any obstacle." She studied the man's face, the practices of it, and understood she was looking at someone who had spent decades getting exactly what he wanted from rooms exactly like this one, simply by outweighing anyone who dared to object. It was a different kind of danger than the kind she had learned to read in Jaeho, quieter, wrapped in courtesy instead of stillness, but no less absolute. "I was never his to release," Talia said, and this time her voice carried an edge that made the silver-haired man's mouth tighten, just slightly. "I filed for divorce. Not him. There's a difference, and it means I get to decide what happens next, not either of you." That was not entirely true, and she knew it even as she said it, standing in a foyer surrounded by men who could end her freedom with a single phone call. But she had learned, across 2 years of marriage to a man who ran an empire through silence and precision, that the only leverage she had in rooms like this was refusing to let anyone speak over her, even when speaking up cost her something. Director Han studied her for a long moment, then turned back to Jaeho with a faint, unhurried smile of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted eventually, regardless of what happened in any single conversation. "We'll speak again," he said. "Soon. This is not finished." He left the way he had arrived, unhurried, 12 SUVs pulling back down the long gravel drive in formation, and it was only once the last set of taillights disappeared through the gate that Talia allowed herself to exhale. That was the moment everything changed, though she would not understand how completely until much later. Jaeho closed the front door and stood with his back against it for a moment, something in his posture loosening slightly now that the house was empty of everyone but the two of them and the staff who knew better than to be seen. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the night of the shooting, assessing, cataloging threat, except this time she understood the threat he was calculating was aimed entirely at her. "You should not have spoken to him like that," he said, but there was no real reprimand in it. Only something closer to worry. "You should not have signed those papers without telling me you were planning to," she said. "I found out this morning when the courier handed me a copy at the door. I signed them, because staying married to me was never supposed to be a life sentence," he said. "I thought releasing you meant giving you back the world you had before all this. I did not expect Han to move this fast. I did not expect him to move at all, honestly. That's my mistake to fix, not yours to inherit." She studied his face, the careful stillness of it, and understood something she had suspected for months, but never said aloud. The marriage had begun as protection, cold and transactional, a legal shield built around a witness who was inconvenient to silence and useful to keep close. But somewhere across 2 years of shared breakfasts and quiet nights, and the particular way he said her name when he thought she was not listening, it had stopped being only that. "I don't want to go back to the world I had before," she said quietly. "That world didn't know what I know now. It didn't know you." Something shifted behind his eyes, subtle, almost involuntary, the closest thing to open emotion she had seen from him in weeks. "You don't understand what Han is offering his son," he said. "It isn't romance. It's territory. My territory, specifically, delivered to him wrapped in the shape of a wife, who happens to be married into it. If you go with him, it isn't a marriage. It's a hostile takeover with a ceremony attached." "Then don't let it happen," she said. "I can't stop him by refusing," Jae-ho said. "Refusal is what he wants. It gives him grounds to say I'm hoarding an asset that belongs to the wider organization. The only thing that stops him is if the divorce never actually takes effect, if I can prove to the commission overseeing both our families that this marriage was never a transaction to begin with." In the days that followed, the estate changed in small ways that told Talia exactly how seriously Jae-ho was taking the threat. Extra cars appeared at the gate. A second driver rotated in beside the first whenever she left for the institute. She noticed, too, that Jae-ho himself began appearing in rooms he had rarely occupied before, the kitchen in the early morning, the hallway outside her study in the evening, small, unexplained overlaps that she understood, without either of them naming it, as a man trying to be near her without admitting that was what he was doing. She let him. She had spent 2 years keeping a careful distance from a marriage she had entered without choice, and she found, watching him linger in doorways with some flimsy excuse about paperwork or security, that she no longer wanted the distance nearly as much as she once had. "And is it?" she asked. "Was it ever, to you?" He crossed the room slowly, the same deliberate stillness he carried into every dangerous negotiation, and stopped close enough that she could smell the faint trace of cedar and something darker underneath, smoke maybe, or the ghost of gunpowder that clung to men who lived the way he lived. "It stopped being a transaction the first time you argued with me about something that had nothing to do with either of our survival," he said. "I don't remember exactly when. I remember being furious that you would not simply agree with me the way everyone else in my life had learned to. I remember realizing sometime after that I did not want you to." She did not answer right away. The silence between them was not empty. It carried 2 years of careful distance collapsing at once, and she found herself wondering how much of what she had told herself was survival instinct had actually been something else entirely, something she had been too careful to name. The danger, however, did not pause to wait for either of them to finish deciding what they felt. 3 nights later, Director Han's people made their first real move. Not a convoy this time, not a show of force meant to be seen. A single car, parked across from the Small Language Institute where Talia still taught 2 evenings a week, the one piece of her old life she had refused to give up even after the marriage began. She noticed the car the way she noticed everything now, trained by 2 years of proximity to danger, and she did not walk to her own vehicle. She walked instead to the security office inside the building and waited until Jae-ho's driver arrived, exactly the protocol he had drilled into her without ever explaining fully why it mattered so much to him. The car followed anyway, at a careful distance, all the way to the edge of the neighborhood where Jae-ho's estate sat behind its gates, and only peeled away once the gates themselves came into view, a message delivered without a single word spoken. "They're not trying to hurt me yet," Talia said that night, standing in the study while Jae-ho reviewed the footage from the gate cameras. "They're showing me they can reach me whenever they decide to stop being patient." Jae-ho's jaw tightened, and for a moment the composure he wore like armor cracked just enough for her to see the fury underneath it, cold and absolute. "They will not get that chance," he said. "You can't promise that by keeping me locked inside these gates," she said. "That's not protection. That's just a different kind of cage, and I've already lived in one of those." He looked at her for a long moment, something conflicted moving behind his eyes, and then he said the thing she suspected he had been avoiding saying since the morning the SUVs arrived. "My wound is exactly this," he said quietly. "Not the shooting you witnessed. Before that, there was a woman before you, someone I loved before I understood what loving someone in this life actually costs. Her name was Yuna. She worked for a rival family, and I convinced myself the two of us could exist outside the war our families were already fighting. I was wrong. They killed her to send my father a message, and I was 3 streets away, close enough to have stopped it if I had understood in time what was happening. Talia said nothing at first, letting the weight of it settle in the room the way it needed to. She had suspected something like this existed underneath his composure for months, glimpsed in the way he sometimes went still at the mention of certain names, the way he had never once, in 2 years, spoken about anything from before their marriage began. Now that she had the shape of it, she found she was not surprised. She was only sad, in a way that surprised her with its depth, for the version of him that had existed before grief taught him to armor everything. "How did you find out?" she asked gently. "Where you were when it happened." "I was told," he said, his voice flat in the way voices go when a person has repeated something to themselves so many times it has worn smooth. "My father called me to a meeting 3 streets from where she was staying. I thought it was business. By the time I understood what the meeting had actually been for, a distraction, timed precisely, it was already finished. I have spent every year since making sure I am never again 3 streets away from something I cannot afford to lose." "That's why you built all of this around control," she said finally. "Every rule, every driver, every camera. You weren't protecting territory. You were trying to make sure you'd never again be 3 streets away from someone you loved when it mattered most." He did not confirm it out loud. He did not need to. The look on his face was confirmation enough, raw in a way she had never seen from him before, and she understood, standing there in the low light of his study, that she was not simply attracted to a dangerous man who happened to be careful with her. She had fallen for the exact shape of his fear, and the exact way he had chosen, despite everything, to let her see it. She crossed the distance between them and took his hand, turning it over, tracing the old thin scar along his knuckle that he had never once explained.
"I'm not Yuna," she said.
"I'm not going to disappear because you're careful enough to lock the gates. But I need you to stop deciding what protects me without asking me first. That's the only way this survives whatever Han decides to do next." He nodded, slow, and for the first time since the papers had arrived warm from the printer, something in his shoulders eased. That night, for the first time in longer than either of them wanted to admit, they sat together in the kitchen instead of in separate rooms, and he made her tea the way she had mentioned once, months earlier, in passing, that her grandmother used to make it. She had not expected him to remember. He set the cup in front of her without comment, and she understood that this small, unremarkable gesture cost him something larger than it looked, a man who ran an empire through calculation, allowing himself one moment of simple, undefended care.
"You remembered," she said.
"I remember everything you tell me," he said. "I just don't always know what to do with it until a moment like this one arrives." She wrapped her hands around the warm cup and let the quiet stretch between them, unbroken by the careful distance that had defined so much of their marriage until now. It was a small thing, a cup of tea made correctly, but she understood, sitting there in the low kitchen light, that small things were exactly how a man like him chose to say what he could not yet bring himself to say outright. The confrontation with Han's people came faster than either of them expected, and it came for her directly. She was leaving the Language Institute on a Thursday evening, later than usual, the parking lot mostly empty under a sky already gone dark with rain clouds, when 2 men stepped out from between parked cars, close enough that running would have meant running directly toward them instead of away. She did not scream. She had learned, across 2 years married to a man who moved through violence like a language he had always spoken, that screaming wasted the half-second she needed to think. Instead, she pivoted hard toward the Institute side entrance, the one with the coded lock she had memorized months ago for exactly this kind of moment, and slammed her palm against the keypad hard enough to trigger the alarm as she wrenched the door open and threw herself inside, the door locking automatically behind her. The 2 men did not follow into a building with cameras and a security company already dialing the police. They melted back into the dark the way men like that always did, unhurried, unbothered, having proven exactly what they came to prove, that she could be reached whenever Han decided the patience was over. She stood with her back against the locked door for several minutes, listening to her own pulse, cataloging details the way Jaeho had once taught her to without either of them ever calling it training. The build of the 2 men. the make of the car parked at the far end of the lot, the direction they had walked when they melted away. She would repeat all of it to him within the hour, and she understood, standing there in the dim hallway light, that she had stopped being someone who simply survived danger and become someone who studied it, the way he did, the way anyone had to in order to last inside this world. The security guard on duty inside the institute offered to call the police, and she let him, though she already suspected, correctly, that whatever report they filed would lead nowhere, that men who worked for someone like Director Han did not leave the kind of evidence a city detective could use. Still, she gave her statement carefully and completely, because a paper trail, however thin, was one more thing she could hand to Jae-ho later, one more piece of proof that this had not been an accident or a misunderstanding but a deliberate warning delivered on purpose. She called Jae-ho from inside the locked building, her hands finally shaking now that the danger had passed and the adrenaline had nowhere left to go, and she heard something in his voice when he answered that she had never heard from him before, a fear that had nothing to do with strategy or territory. "I'm coming," he said. "Stay inside. Don't open that door for anyone but me." He arrived in under 8 minutes, faster than should have been possible from the estate, and when he found her still standing near the security desk, pale but unharmed, he pulled her against him hard enough to feel like relief made physical, uncaring for once who from his own security detail witnessed it. "This ends now," he said into her hair. "I'm done playing this by rules that let Han decide when you're safe. Let me help you end it properly," she said. "Not by hiding me somewhere he can't find me. By giving the commission a reason to side against him permanently." He pulled back to look at her, something in his expression caught between fear and the same reluctant respect she had seen once before, the night he finally told her about Yuna. "You're not part of the commission's politics," he said. "I'm the reason his son wants a wedding instead of a war," she said. "That means I'm already part of the politics, whether either of us likes it or not. Let me use that instead of just surviving it." It took him 2 days to agree, mostly because the alternative, watching her live inside a cage disguised as protection, had become a cost he was no longer willing to pay. He set his own condition before he agreed to hers. That she would never again face Han's people alone, that every step of the plan would run through a security detail he trusted with his own life, and she agreed, understanding that this was not control dressed up as care, but the closest thing to trust a man like him had left to give. What she proposed was simple in structure and dangerous in execution. She would go, publicly, to a commission hearing that Han himself had petitioned for, the one meant to formally dissolve the marriage and clear the way for his son's claim, and instead of standing silently beside Jae-ho the way tradition expected, she would speak for herself. The hearing took place in a private banquet hall on the top floor of a hotel Han's family quietly controlled, a room full of men who had spent their whole lives deciding the fates of women without asking them anything at all. Chandeliers threw hard light across a long table where the commission's elders sat in careful rows, their faces unreadable, their patience visibly thin for anything that resembled sentiment, and Talia felt every eye in the room move to her the moment she walked in beside Jae-ho instead of a step behind him, a small deviation from protocol that several of the older men clearly noticed and did not approve of. Talia stood at the center of that room in a dark green coat, her spine straight, and watched Director Han's practiced smile falter slightly as she began to speak before anyone gave her permission to. "I was married into this family because I witnessed something I wasn't supposed to survive," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "I stayed because a man put his own body between me and a bullet without being asked to. I'm standing here now because a different man decided I could be handed off like territory without once asking what I wanted. I'm telling this room directly. I am not property to be transferred. I choose where I stand, and I am choosing to stand with Jae-ho Kong, not because a piece of paper says I must, but because he is the only person in this room who has ever treated my answer as something that actually matters." The silence that followed was absolute. Director Han's jaw tightened, and Talia watched him understand, in real time, that he had walked into a hearing designed to embarrass Jae-ho and instead handed his rival a public alliance that no member of the commission in that room could easily dismiss, not after watching a woman stand alone and refuse to be spoken for. It was not a clean victory. Han did not simply concede. In the weeks that followed, Two of Jeho's outer perimeter guards were ambushed on a supply route Han's people had clearly been tracking for some time, a violent reminder that pride alone had not ended the conflict. Jeho absorbed the loss the way he absorbed every cost in his world, grim and controlled, making the hard calls a man in his position had to make without flinching from what those calls required. Talia stood beside him through it, understanding now, with open eyes, exactly what she had chosen and exactly what it would keep costing both of them. There were nights in those weeks when she watched him leave the estate before dawn and return long after dark, his jaw tight, his hands steady in the way she had come to recognize as the aftermath of decisions no one should have to make. She did not ask him for details he could not give her. She simply waited, kept the lights on, and understood that this, too, was a kind of choosing, the quiet, unglamorous work of standing beside someone through the cost of the life he led rather than only the parts of it that felt like romance. But the commission's ruling, when it finally came, sided against Han's petition entirely, citing the unusual and, as one elder put it, unprecedented conviction of the woman at the center of the dispute. The marriage stood. The takeover, dressed up as courtship, collapsed under the weight of a room full of powerful men who had not expected to be told no by the one person they had assumed had no voice in the matter at all. Director Han did not speak to either of them again before he left the hearing room, though Talia caught his eyes on her once more as the elders filed out, something unreadable passing across his face, not quite respect and not quite defeat, but perhaps the beginning of an understanding that he had badly miscalculated what kind of woman he was dealing with. Wu Jin, seated silently beside his father throughout the entire proceeding, did not look at her at all, and she suspected, watching him, that whatever admiration Director Han claimed his son carried for her had been his father's invention from the start, a convenient justification wrapped around a business decision that had nothing to do with her at all. Weeks later, once the estate had gone quiet again, and the rain that had greeted 12 black SUVs on that gray morning had finally cleared into something like sunlight, Jeho found Talia standing in the same marble foyer where it had all nearly ended, tracing her fingers along the edge of a small stack of papers on the entry table. "New copies," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I had the lawyers draw them up properly this time. Not a shield. Not a transaction. Something that actually says what's true." She looked down at them, then up at him, and for the first time since she had known him, the almost smile she had glimpsed only once before, briefly, arrived in full, reaching all the way to his eyes. "I told Han's whole commission I choose where I stand," she said. "I meant it. I'm not signing anything just because you put it in front of me either."
"Then don't sign it," he said.
"Just tell me you're staying." She held his gaze a moment longer, letting him wait the way he had let her wait so many times across 2 careful years, and found that she did not want to make him wait any longer than that. She set her hand over his on the table, over the same faint scar she had traced weeks earlier, and let the gesture answer for her the way it always had between them, more honestly than any paperwork ever could. Outside the windows, the driveway that had once filled with 12 black SUVs sat empty and quiet under a clean morning sky, and Talia Winters stood beside a man who had once married her to keep her silent and had, somewhere across 2 impossible years, become the one truth she had never once had to negotiate for. Later that morning, she walked out to the front steps alone, the way she had not been able to do in the anxious weeks after the hearing, and stood in the quiet with her coat pulled close against the last of the cold. She thought about the young woman she had been the night of the shooting, an interpreter with a good job and an ordinary life, who had never once imagined ending up married into an empire she had not asked to enter. That woman would not have recognized herself now, standing on these steps by choice instead of obligation, unafraid of the driveway or the gates or the men who guarded them. Jeho found her there a few minutes later, 2 cups of tea in his hands, made the way her grandmother used to make it, and he did not say anything as he handed one to her. He did not need to. She took it, and they stood together in the quiet morning air, watching the empty drive where 12 black SUVs had once arrived to take her away, and understanding, both of them, that nothing was arriving to take her anywhere she did not choose to go ever again. If this story kept you here until the very last line, that is exactly what it was built to do. Subscribe if you want the next dangerous man and the woman who refuses to be handed off like territory, and drop a comment telling me exactly which line hit hardest. I will see you in the next story.